Snow clung to mountain ridge like a white shroud, burying pines and stone alike in silence. The storm had rolled in at dusk, and by nightfall the world was nothing but a sheet of frozen breath, the kind of cold that found its way through every crack of wood and every seam of cloth. Inside a single log cabin, smoke curled from a stone chimney, carrying the faint smell of venison fat and pine resin. A man sat by the hearth, hands scarred and rough, his frame bent from years of chopping, trapping, surviving. His life had shrunk to simple measures. With stacked high, meat dried and salted, silence kept like a covenant. The mountain did not ask for words. Neither did he offer them. His name had not been spoken much these last years, not by others, and scarcely by himself. He was a man who had once tried living among townsfolk, who had once thought himself part of their church pews, their suppers, their laws. But shame clung to him as tightly as this winter cold, and so he kept away. Some said he had failed his family. Others whispered worse. Out here, the trees did not care what was true, only that he cut them clean and burned them hot. The night deepened, the wind scraping along the cabin walls. We heard it, faint, almost swallowed by the storm. A knock, not sharp, but desperate, muffled in snow. He frowned, listening. For years, no one had knocked. Travelers rarely came this high, when winter closed the passes. He rose, the boards creaking under his boots, and unlatched the heavy door. The figure that leaned against the frame looked as if carved from frost. Snow clung to her lashes, her shawl thin and useless against the storm. Her lips were pale, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she clutched her belly. One arm curved protectively, cradling what was plain even beneath the folds of wool. She was heavy with child. For a moment he only stared, every muscle stiff. Trouble had found him before, always in the shape of people who carried needs greater than he could fill. He had vowed not to open his door again to the world's burdens. But here she stood, no word spoken yet, her eyes wide with something beyond fear, a kind of pleading that stripped away every shield he had built. "Please," she whispered, her voice thin as wind through crack. He should have said no. He should have told her to go back down the mountain, that he had nothing for her, no place, no safety. The child she bore was not his concern. Yet the sight of her fingers, raw, bloodied at the tips from frostbite, caught him, and the faint sound of teeth chattering in the darkness stirred something long buried. He knew what it was to be turned away. He had lived it enough times to recognize it now in her eyes. He stepped aside. Wordless, she stumbled in, knees near buckling, and sank by the fire, her body folded forward, hands still clasped around her stomach, as if protecting the little one within from the cold itself. Heat touched her face, and tears welled unbidden, catching the light like beads of glass. He closed the door against the wind, and stood with arms crossed, unsure. He had not asked her name. He did not want to know it. Names made things too permanent. Still, he could not help but watch her shiver less. Her color returned in fragments as the flames painted her skin in gold. "You saved me," she said after a long silence, her voice rough as though unused for days. "I'd have lain down in the snow before morning." He grunted, neither accepting thanks nor rejecting it. Instead, he moved the pot on the fire, ladled broth into a wooden bowl, and set it before her. She lifted it carefully, as if even that act took strength she did not have to spare, and sipped. The steam softened the hollows in her face. The cabin felt altered already, though he could not name why. For years the crackle of fire had been his only companion. Now every flicker seemed to throw light across her shoulders. Every hiss of the log seemed to echo with some new rhythm. She did not speak again for a while, just ate slowly, gratefully. Then, glancing at him with wary eyes, she murmured, "I've nowhere else. Folks down the valley, they said there was nothing for me there." She stopped, biting her lip, perhaps ashamed of confessing too much. He shifted uneasily. The words stirred memories of whispers he once endured, accusations, half-truths, the sting of being turned away from places that called themselves righteous. He knew too well what she meant without her saying it plain. "You can warm yourself," he said at last, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Rest tonight. That's all." She nodded, bowing her head as if even this meager mercy was more than she had expected. The hours stretched. Outside, the storm howled as it determined to bury them both. Inside, the fire burned low, painting the cabin in softer tones. He sat on his stool, sharpening his knife, though the blade needed little work. She lay curled on a bed of furs near the hearth, her breathing uneven, one hand always circling the swell of her stomach. Every so often she winced, and he wondered if the child stirred restless inside her, a small life pressing against the edge of this hard world. He did not ask. He would not, yet his gaze returned again and again, pulled by something he had not felt in years, the fragile tether of another's presence. As the night waned, he found himself recalling the last time someone had shared this fire. Memory was a cruel companion. He shoved it down, focusing on the crack of ice shifting on the roof. But still, when she shivered in her sleep, he rose, took the heavy blanket from his own cot, and laid it gently over her shoulders. She stirred, opened her eyes for a heartbeat, and gave a faint smile before sleep reclaimed her. He stood there a moment, looking down at the stranger who had arrived like a ghost in the snow. Something within him, cold for so long, shifted uneasily. He told himself she was only another mouth to feed, another trouble dropped at his door. He told himself she would leave when the storm broke. But even as he returned to his stool, even as he tried to steady his hands on the knife's hilt, he knew the truth. The storm had not merely brought her to his threshold. It had brought her into the silence he thought he wanted, into the solitude he believed unbreakable. And now, as dawn began to press its faint blue light through the cracks of the cabin walls, he understood this much. Nothing would be the same. Morning came pale and cold, with frost feathering the window glass and silence, so deep it seemed the mountain itself was holding its breath. The man rose early, as he always did, pulling on his boots and stepping outside to fetch wood. The snow lay heavy, each step sinking him to the knee. He welcomed the strain of it, the way it burned his muscles, because it gave him something to do with the unease gnawing his chest. When he returned, arms loaded, she was awake, sitting by the fire with the blanket drawn tight around her. Her eyes followed him, wary but softer than the night before. He stacked the wood without a word, brushed snow from his beard, and set the kettle over the flames. The stranger shifted, as if unsure of her place, before she rose to her feet. Her balance was slow, her body heavy with child, yet she moved with the dignity of someone who refused to beg. "I can cook," she said, her voice low, still raw from cold and weariness. He hesitated, then stepped aside. She tried, but her hands trembled as she lifted the iron pan. The spoon clattered against the edge, broth splashing. He reached over, steadying it, his hand brushing hers only for an instant before he pulled back. Without speaking, he took the work from her. Her shoulders slumped, but not in defeat, more in acceptance of what her body no longer allowed. When the food was ready, he set a bowl before her and another for himself. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of fire and the faint creak of the cabin timbers. Yet beneath that silence, something moved, a shift, fragile and strange, as though the very air had grown heavier with meaning. She glanced at him once, catching him watching, and quickly lowered her gaze. Days passed in this rhythm. He chopped wood, hunted, tended traps. She stayed close to the fire, sewing small tears in his shirts with stiff, reddened fingers. The cabin began to hold a different shape, as if the space itself was adjusting to two lives instead of one. He found her humming sometimes, faint and unfinished melodies, no more than a breath of song. It startled him, for it had been years since music had brushed against his ears. He said nothing, but the sound followed him even into the woods. When the storm eased, he prepared for a supply trip to the valley. He saddled his mule, loaded what pelts he had, and found her standing by the doorway, watching him with unease. "They'll talk," she said softly. He paused, his hand tightening on the rope. Of course they would. The townsfolk never spared their tongues, especially for a man already marked by suspicion, and now with a pregnant woman under his roof, the whispers would become knives. He gave a small grunt and turned away, but her words clung to him as he made his way down the trail. The town was just as he remembered, faces glancing, then turning, lips moving behind gloved hands. The general store smelled of flour and dust, and the shopkeeper's eyes lingered too long when he noticed the items chosen. Fabric for a woman, dried herbs often used for childbirth. No questions were spoken, but the silence in that room was heavy enough to choke him. Outside, a man at the hitching post muttered loud enough for others to hear. "He's taking what ain't his. A fool or worse." Laughter followed, sharp as glass. The mountain man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He strapped the supplies tight, mounted, and rode back toward the hills, each word biting deeper than the wind on his face. When he returned, she was by the fire, mending a small tear in one of his coats. She looked up quickly, searching his face, reading more than he wished to show. "They spoke," she murmured, though it was not a question. He set the bundles down hard, unwilling to answer. Silence settled, heavier than before. That night, he lay awake long after she had drifted into restless sleep. The child stirred within her, the sound faint but clear, like a whisper beneath the fire's crackle. He listened, staring at the rafters, torn between resentment and something he dared not name. He had sworn never to care again, never to shoulder what did not belong to him. Yet every small movement from her belly seemed to echo in his chest. The next morning, she rose early and swept the floor, her steps slow but steady. He watched her for a long while before he asked, in a voice roughened by disuse, "Why here? Why my door?" She paused, her hands tightening on the broom. "Because it was the only door left to me," she said. No bitterness, no plea, just a simple truth spoken like a stone dropped in water. Her words lingered through the day. He split wood until his arms ached, but the sound of them would not leave his ears. That evening, when she sat by the fire, he found himself studying the slope of her shoulders, the quiet resolve in the way she worked thread through cloth. She carried her shame differently than he carried his. Where he had hidden in solitude, she wore hers openly, yet still moved forward. The days stretched into weeks. Outside, the world lay under white silence, the trails swallowed by drifts. Inside, the cabin filled with a strange warmth that had little to do with fire. They spoke little, yet each gesture grew heavy with meaning. The way he set food before her without being asked, the way she draped his coat over his chair after sewing its torn sleeve. They built a language of small mercies. One evening, she began to hum again, the same half-remembered tune. This time, he did not look away. He let the sound fill the room, soft as falling snow, until the silence no longer felt like a burden but like a balm. When she finished, she caught him staring. A faint smile touched her lips, shy and fleeting, before she bent again to her sewing. Outside, the snow fell steady, a curtain drawn across the mountains. Inside, the fire burned low, and two souls sat in its glow, bound not by words but by the fragile beginnings of trust. The mountain man knew the valley tongues would sharpen again when the thaw came, that whispers would grow louder with each step she took it aside. But for now, as embers glowed and her quiet song lingered in the air, he found himself wondering if perhaps the cold he had carried for so long was finally beginning to melt. The storm broke in the night, leaving the world glazed in silver. Icicles hung from the eaves like daggers of glass, and the snow stretched unbroken beneath the moon. The cabin was quiet, save for the fire that breathed in slow rhythm, its light painting the walls in restless patterns. He sat at the table, hands roughened by years of axe and rifle, sharpening a blade though it had no need of sharpening. Across the room she sat curled in the furs, one hand always resting against her belly, her eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. For a long time neither spoke. Silence had become their common ground, a space safer than words. But that night, perhaps because the storm had lifted, perhaps because the fire seemed softer, she drew a slow breath and let her voice wander into the stillness. "I was a wife once," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the fire. For a little while, he stilled, the blade poised in his grip. Her voice was low, more confession than story, and he did not interrupt. She spoke of a man taken by fever, sudden and merciless. She spoke of kinfolk who, rather than offer shelter, turned her away with sharp words and sharper eyes. Her hands trembled as she described walking through snow with no roof but the sky, no comfort but the child she carried. "I thought I might die on that trail," she whispered, her face catching the light like porcelain about to crack. He felt the words cut deeper than he wished, not because of her grief alone, but because of the familiarity of it. He knew what it was to be cast aside, to be measured and found wanting by others. Yet he said nothing, only watched her eyes glisten and her lips press tight as she forced her tears back into silence. She carried her pain like a woman who had grown tired of pleading. When she fell quiet, the fire hissed, filling the space her story left. He set down the blade, unable to keep his own silence. His voice came rough, uneven, like stones turned in a riverbed. I failed once, too, not in the way of losing someone to fever, but in turning my back when I should have stood fast. A brother, blood of my blood. He swallowed hard, the memory thick in his throat. I carried shame down every road, until no town would have me. Out here seemed easier than facing the eyes of men. The words felt strange in his mouth, as though dragged up from a pit long sealed. He had not spoken them aloud in years. Yet her presence, the fragile courage in her confession, had loosened what the wilderness had bound. For a while they sat, two shadows cast by the same flame, both marked by losses that had driven them into the cold. And in that shared stillness, something stirred. It was not comfort, not yet, but recognition. He rose and pulled his coat from its peg, draping it across her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled, as though such a simple act carried more weight than it should. "You'll need it more than me," she said, her voice unsteady. "Got another," he answered, though the words were clumsy, meant more as shield than truth. Her lips curved into a faint smile, small and fleeting, but real. She pulled the coat tighter and lowered her gaze again, the fire's glow softening the hollows of her face. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the cabin changed. She no longer tried to hide the sound of her tears when pain seized her body. He did not ask questions, but he kept the kettle hot and left broth at her side. She, in turn, began leaving small things for him, his tools cleaned, his boots brushed free of ice, a cup set at the table before he sat down. They built a pattern of quiet gestures, each one a thread binding them closer, though neither spoke of it. Yet shadows still lingered. At night, when the wind moaned through the trees, he lay awake listening to her breathing, wondering what weight she bore beyond the child, wondering if he had invited more than he could shoulder. And she, though safe by the fire, often stared at the door as if expecting it to be thrown open by the voices of the valley, come to drag her back into judgment. One evening, as dusk bled into night, she went sharply, her hand pressing hard against her side. He moved toward her, uncertain, but she shook her head. "Not yet," she said through clenched teeth, as though the child had chosen that moment to remind her of its claim. He stood there, helpless, the memory of every failure gnawing at him. At last he crouched beside her, his hand hovering, then settling lightly against her shoulder. The warmth of her skin startled him. She met his gaze, her breath ragged, and for the first time he saw not just survival in her eyes, but trust. The pain eased, leaving her trembling. She leaned back, drawing slow breaths, and whispered, "I don't fear the cold anymore." "Not here." He had no answer. His throat burned with words he could not shape. So he only nodded, turning his eyes back to fire. But the truth lodged in him like a cold that would not cool. Her presence had changed the cabin more than the seasons ever could. The winter pressed on, the snow deepening. The paths to town nearly vanished. They were left to themselves, their lives braided by necessity and by something more fragile. Each night, as the fire cast its shadows higher on the walls, they inched closer to a bond neither had sought, but both now needed. The mountain man knew the thaw would come, and with it, the eyes and tongues of the valley. He knew whispers would sharpen, that judgment would descend like the cold. But as he watched her sleep, her face softened by the glow, her hand resting steady over the child, he felt the stirrings of something that defied shame, something tender, quiet, but strong as the mountains themselves. And though he would not speak it aloud, not yet, he understood that the shadows and the firelight were no longer only his. They were theirs. The night had closed in hard, wrapping the cabin in a stillness broken only by the crackle of the fire. Gideon sat hunched near the hearth, knife in hand, working the edge of a strip of rawhide, though his mind was anywhere but on the task. Across the room, Mary lay restless, her swollen belly shifting beneath the quilt as though the child inside were impatient with the world's waiting. Her eyes followed him, quiet but full of questions neither dared voice. "Storms passed," he muttered, more to the flames than to her. The wind no longer rattled the shutters, but the silence it left behind pressed down heavier. "Tracks be clear come morning. If they're coming, it'll be soon." Mary's fingers tightened on the quilt. "You think they won't wait?" "They've waited long enough." His jaw set hard. Gideon knew men like Jonas Crowley. They nursed grudges like wildfire in dry brush, feeding off fear, waiting for the spark. He could all but hear the preacher's righteous bellow carried on the night air, stirring men who had never thought their own hearts cruel. Mary shifted, wincing as a child inside jabbed. "I never asked you to stand against them. You could still let them take you?" His voice cut sharp, then faltered. He pushed the knife point into the wood beside him, letting it stand upright. "I ain't sending you out there to face them alone. Not after—" He trailed off, words choking in the space between them. The silence deepened, broken by the pop of a log collapsing into ash. Mary turned her face toward the ceiling beams. "All my life I've known the weight of men's judgment. If they find me here, they'll see only what they want, some fallen woman hiding behind your roof. Not a soul among them will care about truth." Her voice carried no plea, only a tired resignation that set something in Gideon's chest burning hotter than the fire. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her cot. His hand hovered, unsure, before settling on the quilt near hers. "Then let him try to twist it. I'll give him something else to reckon with." Her eyes found his, a flicker of something fragile softening the edge of her fear. "Why risk your life for me?" He swallowed. The truth came out ragged, stripped bare. "Because somewhere along the way, you made me remember I still got one. Thought I buried it years back with all the rest." Her lips parted, as though she might speak, but footsteps outside cut through the moment like a knife. Both froze. Gideon rose, his hand falling to the rifle propped near the hearth. He moved to the window, peering into the firelit snow. Shapes moved between the dark trees, too many to mistake for shadows. "They've come." Mary struggled to sit, panic flaring in her eyes. "You can't, there's too many." He chambered around, steady as stone. "Don't matter how many, they'll see this ain't theirs a claim." The first voice carried through the night, booming and righteous. "Gideon Hale, you harbor a sinner under your roof, and by God's law she must be delivered up." Crowley's tone dripped venom. Each word sharpened a wound. Gideon stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand, lantern light spilling around him. The faces gathered beyond the yard blurred in shadow, but the glint of steel caught firelight. Pitchforks, axes, a scatter of rifles. "You'll not cross this threshold," Gideon called back, his voice steady, iron underlined with quiet fury. Crowley stepped forward, tall and thin, eyes gleaming with zeal beneath the brim of his hat. "You defied God's will for the sake of a harlot who carries sin in her womb?" Behind him, murmurs stirred, men shifting uneasily. Gideon leveled the rifle, his silhouette stark against the cabin's glow. "You call it sin. I call it life. And it ain't yours to judge nor take." For a moment, only the fire crackled, the cold night holding its breath. Crowley sneered, lifting his Bible high. "Then you'll share damnation." He raised a hand, and the mob surged forward. Gideon fired. The cracks shattering the night, the round sparking off a tree trunk near the front ranks. The men jolted back, fear flashing across faces that had come certain of their cause. "I'll not warn again," Gideon barked. "The next one strikes true." Mary's cry cut through the standoff. From inside, her voice rose, strained and desperate. "Gideon," it was no plea for help, but the raw sound of labor begun. His heart lurched. He risked a glance back, saw her doubled over, hands gripping the quilt, sweat already beading her brow. The child was coming here and now, in the midst of this madness. Crowley's eyes lit with cruel triumph. There, proof of her corruption. God himself brings forth judgment tonight. Gideon's temper snapped. He stepped off the stoop, rifle still firm, his voice low but carrying. "You call yourself a man of God, but you'd see a woman bleed in the snow rather than lay down your pride." That ain't faith. That's hunger for power, dressed in scripture. The mob wavered. Some dropped their eyes, shame pricking at their certainty. A few still clutched their weapons tight, torn between fear of Gideon's rifle and the weight of Crowley's voice. For within the cabin came another cry, Mary's, fierce and pained, echoing with a wild determination of life, refusing to be stilled. Gideon's chest clenched. He could not stand out here while she bore it alone. He backed toward the door, rifle never lowering. You want to call me a sinner? Do it. But if you step foot in this cabin, you'll answer for more than words. He slammed the door shut, barring it fast, the thud of mob's uncertainty muffled beyond the walls. Inside, the air thickened with heat and urgency. Mary's breath came hard, her eyes wide and brimming. I can't, she gasped. You can, Gideon said, kneeling at her side. He set the rifle within reach, then took her hand, rough palm enfolding hers with unexpected gentleness. You ain't alone, not tonight. The hours blurred into a haze of firelight, her cries mingling with his steady murmurs, guiding, anchoring. The mob outside grew restless, their shouts fading into silence as the storm of labor consumed the cabin. And then at last, a new cry pierced the air, not Mary's, but the thin, fierce wail of a newborn child. Gideon held the small, trembling life in his calloused hands, awe striking him mute. He laid the child against Mary's chest, her face wet with tears of exhaustion and wonder. They'll hear, she whispered, voice raw. They'll know. Lem, Gideon said, his gaze fixed on the flame-lit curve of her smile as she cradled the child. Let the world see life where they only saw sin. That's the truth they can't take. Beyond the walls, the mob had quieted, their certainty broken by the sound of new life carried through the night air. Even Crowley's voice failed to rise above it. In the hush that followed, the fire burned steady, casting shadows that spoke of trials weathered and strength found in the unlikeliest of bonds. Inside, Gideon sat beside Mary, his hand resting over hers, the weight of years of solitude easing for the first time. Redemption had not come with steel or scripture, but with the fragile cry of a child and the woman who had taught him to feel its worth. And as dawn's first light crept over mountains, it carried with it the quiet promise that neither of them would walk the path ahead alone.